Hi, I'm Dave Cullen. I wrote the book Columbine and then the book Parkland, and I've been covering this kind of horror of school shootings for 25 years. You know, I say that Columbine wasn't the first school shooting or mass shooting, but it definitely kicked off and created the mass shooter era that we're living in this now because that happened.
And talk to me about the myths that grew in the early days of Columbine coverage and why are those so harmful?
Yeah, the Columbine myth is just horrible. That's a big part of my book. And so right now, within 30 days, everyone in America understood why these kids did it, right? Two loner, outcasts, misfits, possibly goths from the Trenchcoat Mafia went on a revenge attack against the jocks who had brutally bullied them for years, right? Everybody probably has heard most or all of that. Not a single thing I just said is true. Every one of them is wrong. In the first hour, there were just, open-ended questions. Like, did you know these kids? Do you know why they did it? And most kids said no, they didn't know them. There's 2,000 kids in high school. My high school was like that. You don't know most of the people, especially if you're a freshman. You don't know any seniors. So they were getting certain questions, certain things. Occasionally, Trenchcoat Mafia came up. So in the second hour, there were more leading questions. Like, we're hearing some of the students telling us that, blah, blah, blah. And so they were feeding the answers to the kids. And the kids were saying yes to a lot of them. And by the third hour, it was more like almost a fact. Like, we understand that blah, 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 that these are jocks and blah, blah, Trenchcoat Mafia. And by the fourth hour, they weren't even asking. They were telling. Every classroom in Columbine has a TV in it. Most of them had the TV on with the volume down or off because they knew thought the killers were still in there. So they were monitoring the news, and the parents were calling in, friends were calling back. They were constantly talking to people on the outside. So people on the outside were telling them what the news is telling them. So later that afternoon, when there was still about 600 kids trapped in the school, as they started coming out hours after, we thought they were perfect witnesses, uncontaminated is the word that law enforcement use. They were all contaminated. So when they started all telling us, oh, the Trenchcoat Mafia, like they're all saying it. Yeah, because they'd heard it from us. So it was this horrible feedback loop. What's much, much worse, though, is a lot of people, other misfits, types, self-described, online, went with that story and see Eric and Dylan as avenging angels and heroes for the misfits everywhere who fought back against the jocks and were heroic for them. Eric and Dylan were they couldn't care less. They made fun of the bullied kids, and they weren't doing this for anybody else. But that is the story that went out. I have a picture in my the new preface in the new edition, which is a diagram which drove me to continue doing this. There's something like 55 different mass shooters on the page, and they're all connected to like a big web of Columbine at the center. Every one of those left evidence that they either were inspired by or modeled their attack after Columbine. Columbine has left this web, and it's getting worse and it's expanding.
Psychologists talk about that the idea that a school shooter just snapped is a myth, and I'd love for you to address that.
Nobody snaps. They all planned this. The first sort of exhaustive study that the Secret Service did, actually jointly with the Department of Education, they studied all the school shootings going back to the first one that they knew of. And determined that I think every single one of them planned. And in some cases, several hours or a day. But Nearly all of them were at least a week or more. The biggest chunk was like weeks and months, and some up to a year, including Columbine.
Do you think today's students understand how much the events at Columbine have changed their daily experiences?
No, I know they don't, because I've been to hundreds of schools and I ask them. And I'll be in a field house with 2,000 kids and I'll say, so who's heard of Columbine? Just about everybody. Essentially, they all know that it's this giant thing that happened that changed the world somehow, and don't really know what happened there or what it changed or why. And then I ask specific things. Almost every school, they'll have their ID hanging around their neck. And I say, when do you think students started wearing those at the school? And they're just sort of like, forever. Like, why wouldn't it? I'm like, April 21st, 1999, or sometimes the day after Columbine or shortly after. And I said, how about lockdown drills? When did they start? I'm like, I think it's like fire drills, like forever. And I say, we hadn't even invented the word until after Columbine. They're totally, and by then that's just like blowing their minds. And then, the third one I would say is like the desk or whatever in the hallway where outsiders have to check in and get a pass if they want to be in there. When did that start? Same thing. And I told them, like, adults could just walk into your school and walk around before Columbine. And they're like, they can't even imagine that. They have no idea.
If I'm a teacher today, if I'm a teacher on the 25-year mark from Columbine, what would you want a teacher to think about, and how would you want them to take something from this story?
I got a couple very specific things. If this does happen in your school, which I imagine somebody watching this, it will, call the Rebel Network, Google the Rebel Network immediately, and they will help you that afternoon. And they have like the best experts in the country, and they can point you to everything else you need. And they specialize in that of like day one. And so they'll try to get to that school too, but like day one, if something happens, you're like, who the hell do we call? Call the Rebel Network. Two specific things before this shooting that I want to get through. Because I said earlier, you need a team of people that you can go to because it's really complicated and nobody can, understand it all deeply. There's two things that are not complicated that every teacher in America and every administrator should know, and they're actually very memorable once you grasp. The first one is the long-range thing leading up to the months or years while somebody's planning this. It's less about a single warning sign, it's the repetition. Dylan's creative writing project in isolation is not a huge warning sign. Lots of kids do, write violent, like short stories. It's creative writing. What happens is like every time a kid gets an assignment to write about something or doing something or put on a play or whatever, like they always do it on guns and violence and something like this. They're obsessed with this. Then in the short term, when somebody is actually like saying they're going to do something, the risk is specificity. If they mention the specific weapon, even more, because that means they probably got it. Like, he's not going to say, and it's almost always a boy, he's not going to say what weapon he is going to use unless he's already acquired it, right? These clues, any teacher can figure out what it points to. And the weapon is really bad because that's the last thing they do. Keep those things in mind. Specificity in the short run of an actual thing, and long-term repetition or different sort of ways he does it. So I have a handful of specific recommendations for everyone in the field that you should all know. Number one, most important, screen for depression. This is the form you can download. It is the PHQ-9, I always forget it. Everyone should have that handed out in homeroom at least once a year. Every principal, specifically an administrator, should know the name of the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. That is the amazing crack team that studies stress threat assessment and how to look for them. Every school should have a team of at least 3 or 4 people who are trained by the FBI or other training groups they have on how to assess threats, because it's really complicated. Then everyone in the school should know those 3 or 4 people are who to go to if you have a student and you need someone to talk to wonder if this is really important. Then on threat assessment yourself, no one can understand it all, but all of you can know 2 key things. Number 1, over the long term, is repetition. A kid who every project writes about gun or violence and bakes a cake in the shape of a gun, actually happened, the more he does that, that's your risk factor. Not how intense, how many times. And in the short run, when it's getting very close, the key thing is specificity. It's not about how horrible it says it does. If he says, I'm going to do it in homeroom Thursday at 10 a.m. in this class with this kind of gun especially, that means he already bought the gun. That means it's getting really close, high risk, probably call the FBI today.